The town of Deadwood, South Dakota, had seen its share of heartbreak in the spring of 1876, but none quite like the curse that seemed to follow Sarah McKenna wherever she went. Sarah stood behind the counter of her father's general store, arranging tins of beans with mechanical precision, while Mrs. Henderson and her daughter whispered loud enough for half the establishment to hear. "That poor girl," Mrs. Henderson said, shaking her head with exaggerated sympathy. "Every man who loved her left. First Thomas rode off to California without a word. Then James got himself killed in that mining accident just weeks after proposing. And poor William, well, he just up and married someone else entirely." Sarah's hands stilled on the shelf, her jaw tightening. She had heard these whispers 1,000 times in the past 2 years, but they never stopped cutting deep. The worst part was that Mrs. Henderson spoke the truth. 3 men had courted her seriously, and all 3 had vanished from her life in different devastating ways. The town had taken to calling her cursed, warning their sons away from the beautiful but supposedly doomed woman with auburn hair and green eyes that could stop a man's heart. "I heard her own father's worried sick," the younger Henderson girl added. "Says she will die alone if this keeps up." Sarah slammed a tin down harder than intended, the metallic clang echoing through the store. Both women jumped, then hurried toward the door with their purchases forgotten. Sarah did not call them back. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden counter, breathing slowly through her nose, fighting the familiar sting of tears. "Do not let them get to you, sweetheart," her father said, emerging from the back room with a crate of supplies. Patrick McKenna was a kind man with graying hair and tired eyes, widowed for 10 years and devoted entirely to his only daughter. "People talk because their own lives are boring." "They talk because they believe I am cursed, Papa," Sarah said quietly. "And maybe they are right." "Nonsense. You have had bad luck, nothing more. The right man will come along." Sarah wanted to believe him, but after 2 years of sideways glances and pitying stares, she had begun to wonder if she was destined to remain alone. She was 23 years old, well past the age when most women in Deadwood had married and started families. Her youth was slipping away, and with it, any hope of the life she had once dreamed of having. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah looked up to see Mayor Daniels entering with a worried expression. "Patrick, I need to speak with you. It is urgent." Her father set down the crate and moved to meet the mayor, their voices dropping to hushed tones near the window. Sarah tried not to eavesdrop, but certain words carried across the store anyway. Supply wagon, ambushed, mountain passes, dangerous. When the mayor left, her father returned to the counter looking 10 years older. "The supply wagon from Cheyenne was attacked yesterday. 3 men killed. We are running low on medicine, flour, and other essentials. Without those supplies, people will suffer come winter." "What will you do?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. Her father was on the town council. He would help find a solution. "We need someone who knows those mountain passes, someone who can get through safely. The mayor is asking around." He paused, rubbing his weathered face. "There is a man living up in the mountains north of here. Folks say he is the best tracker and hunter in the territory. They call him Garrett Kane." Sarah had heard the name before, whispered with a mixture of fear and respect. The mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness, who came to town maybe twice a year to trade furs and supplies. Some said he was running from a violent past. Others claimed he was half wild himself, more comfortable with wolves than people. She had never seen him, but the stories painted him as someone to avoid. "Will he help?" she asked. "If the price is right, maybe. The mayor is sending someone up to his cabin tomorrow to ask." That night, Sarah lay awake in her small room above the store, listening to the sounds of Deadwood settling into darkness. Somewhere out there, beyond the ramshackle buildings and muddy streets, a man lived alone in the mountains. She wondered what kind of person chose complete solitude over the company of others. Perhaps someone who had been hurt as deeply as she had. Perhaps someone who understood that sometimes staying away from people was easier than risking more pain. The next day passed slowly. Sarah helped customers, restocked shelves, and tried not to think about the whispers that followed her everywhere. By evening, word had spread through town that the mountain man had agreed to help, but only if someone from the town council accompanied him to verify the route and help negotiate with the supplier in Cheyenne. Her father had volunteered. "Absolutely not," Sarah said when he told her that night over dinner. Papa, those mountain passes are dangerous. You said so yourself. Which is why Garrett Kane is the perfect guide. The man knows every trail, every creek, every hiding spot in those mountains. Then let him go alone. The supplier will not release goods to a stranger without proper authorization. I have to go, Sarah. She stared at her father's lined face, seeing the determination there, but also the exhaustion. He was 58 years old, strong for his age, but not as strong as he once was. The journey would be difficult, possibly dangerous. Then I am coming with you. Absolutely not. Papa, you cannot stop me. If you are riding into danger, I am not staying here alone, wondering if you will come back. She did not add the other truth, that she needed to escape Deadwood, even temporarily. The whispers, the stares, the constant reminder of her failures, she needed distance from all of it. They argued for an hour, but Sarah was her father's daughter, stubborn and determined. Finally, he relented on one condition. She would do exactly as Garrett Kane instructed. In the mountains, the guide's word was law. 3 days later, Sarah stood in front of the general store at dawn, watching a figure emerge from the mist that clung to the northern hills. Even from a distance, she could tell he was unlike any man she had ever seen in Deadwood. Garrett Kane rode a massive gray horse, sitting straight and confident in the saddle. As he drew closer, Sarah found herself unable to look away. He was tall, powerfully built, with shoulders that seemed broad enough to carry the weight of the mountains themselves. His hair was dark brown, long enough to brush his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that had seen years of hard use, and a rifle rested easily across his saddle. But it was his eyes that caught her attention most. Even from several feet away, she could see they were a startling pale blue, sharp and assessing, missing nothing. When his gaze landed on her, she felt suddenly exposed, as though he could see straight through to her bones. "You must be Patrick McKenna," he said, his voice a deep rumble as he dismounted in one smooth motion. He was even larger up close, all muscle and controlled strength. "I am," her father said, stepping forward to shake hands. "And this is my daughter Sarah. She will be accompanying us." Garrett's eyes cut to Sarah, and she saw his jaw tighten beneath the beard. "No." "Excuse me," Sarah said, her spine straightening. "Too dangerous, she stays here." "I am going," Sarah said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My father is all I have. Where he goes, I go." "The mountain passes are no place for a woman. Then perhaps you should improve your guiding skills so they become safer." For a moment, something flickered in those pale eyes, surprise maybe, or annoyance. Then his expression hardened again. "I leave in 30 minutes. If you cannot keep up, I will leave you behind. Understood?" "Understood," Sarah said, refusing to be intimidated by his size or his gruff manner. Garrett turned away, leading his horse toward the livery. Sarah's father touched her arm gently. "You do not have to do this, sweetheart." "Yes, I do," she said, watching the mountain man's retreating form. "Now let us get our horses ready before he decides to leave without us." 28 minutes later, they rode north out of Deadwood with Garrett Kane in the lead. Sarah had chosen her most practical clothing, a split riding skirt, sturdy boots, a simple blouse, and a wool jacket. She had tied her long auburn hair back in a braid, and she carried a small pack with essentials. Her father had insisted she take his spare revolver, which now rested heavy against her hip. Garrett set a steady pace, neither too fast nor too slow, but he did not speak or look back to check on them. Sarah got the distinct impression he was pretending they did not exist. The first day passed without incident. They climbed gradually into the foothills, following trails that were barely visible to Sarah's eyes, but that Garrett navigated with absolute confidence. The landscape transformed around them, the scrubby plains giving way to pine forests and rocky outcroppings. The air grew cooler and cleaner, scented with pine and earth. When the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Garrett finally stopped in a small clearing near a creek. "We camp here," he said, dismounting and immediately beginning to unsaddle his horse. Sarah slid from her saddle, her legs protesting after hours of riding. She was an experienced rider, but this was more intense than her usual trips around Deadwood. Her father looked equally tired, though he tried to hide it. "I will gather firewood," she offered, needing to move and stretch her sore muscles. "Stay where I can see you," Garrett said without looking up from his work. Sarah bristled at the command but bit back a sharp response. They were in his territory now, and she had promised to follow his instructions. She gathered fallen branches from the edge of the clearing, very aware of Garrett's eyes tracking her movements. By the time she returned with an armful of wood, he had already built a fire ring and was striking flint to tinder. Within moments, flames flickered to life. Sarah watched him work, noting the economy of his movements, the quiet competence. Everything he did seemed purposeful, nothing wasted. "There's coffee in my pack," he said, still not looking directly at her, "and dried meat. Help yourself." It was not exactly a warm invitation, but Sarah appreciated the gesture. She found the supplies and prepared coffee while her father tended to their horses. The three of them ate in silence, the crackling fire and distant creak the only sounds. Finally, Patrick cleared his throat. "How long have you lived in the mountains, Mr. Kane?" 8 years. "That's a long time to be alone." Garrett's eyes flicked up, meeting Patrick's gaze briefly before returning to the fire. "I prefer it that way. Still, it must get lonely. Loneliness is better than most alternatives." Sarah wondered what he meant by that, but did not ask. There was something in his tone that warned against prying. Instead, she sipped her coffee and studied him across the flames. In the firelight, his face seemed carved from stone, all hard angles and sharp edges. But there was something in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, a deep weariness, maybe even sadness. "You should sleep," Garrett said, addressing both of them. "We leave at first light." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "I will keep watch." "All night?" "I sleep light, and something needs to keep the fire going." Sarah wanted to argue, to suggest they take turns, but exhaustion was pulling at her bones. She spread her bedroll near the fire, her father doing the same on the opposite side. Within minutes, Patrick was snoring softly. Sarah lay awake longer, watching Garrett through half-closed eyes. He sat with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. She wondered what he was watching for: animals, bandits, or just the ghosts of whatever had driven him into these mountains. Eventually, despite her best efforts, sleep claimed her. She woke once in the deep hours of night, disoriented by unfamiliar sounds and the hard ground beneath her. The fire had burned down to embers, and at first she thought Garrett had moved. Then she spotted him, standing at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the star-filled sky. There was something unutterably lonely about his silhouette, and Sarah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for this hard, closed-off man. Morning came too soon, announced by Garrett's voice saying, "Time to move." Sarah groaned and sat up, every muscle in her body protesting. Her father looked equally stiff as he rolled up his bedding. Garrett, meanwhile, looked exactly as he had the night before, alert, composed, and completely unaffected by sleeping on the ground. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and hardtack, then continued north. The terrain grew more challenging, the trails steeper and rockier. Sarah's horse picked its way carefully over loose stones, while Garrett's mount moved with sure-footed confidence. Around midday, they stopped to water the horses at a stream. Sarah dismounted and walked to the water's edge, splashing the cold liquid on her face and neck. When she straightened, she found Garrett watching her. "You ride well," he said, and it sounded almost like an accusation. "Thank you," Sarah said carefully. "My father taught me when I was young. Most town women cannot handle more than a gentle trot down Main Street." "I am not most town women." Something flickered across his face, approval, maybe, or respect. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you are not." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her, and Sarah felt absurdly pleased. She told herself it did not matter what this gruff mountain man thought of her, but some part of her recognized that as a lie. That afternoon, they encountered their first real obstacle, a narrow trail that hugged the side of a steep cliff face. To the left, rock rose straight up. To the right, a dizzying drop fell away into a canyon far below. Patrick looked at the trail and went pale. "Jesus," he muttered. "Stay close to the rock face," Garrett instructed. "Let your horse find its footing. Do not look down." He went first, his gray horse moving calmly along the treacherous path. Sarah followed, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the empty air to her right, could imagine her horse stumbling, both of them tumbling into that terrible void. "Eyes forward, Sarah," Garrett called back, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Trust your horse. He has done this before." She focused on Garrett's broad back ahead of her, using him as an anchor point. Step by step, they made their way across the narrow trail. Behind her, she could hear her father's labored breathing, but she did not dare turn to look. After what felt like an eternity, the trail widened again, merged onto safer ground. Sarah released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking. Garrett had stopped and was watching them both. When Sarah met his eyes, she saw something unexpected there. Concern. "You did well," he said. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Fear means you are smart. Only fools feel no fear in the mountains." They made camp early that evening, all three of them exhausted by the challenging ride. While Patrick rested, Sarah helped Garrett gather firewood and prepare dinner. He showed her how to cook flatbread in a pan over the fire, his large hands surprisingly deft as he demonstrated. "Where did you learn to survive out here?" she asked, watching him work. "Spent time with Shoshone hunters when I first came to the mountains. They taught me what I needed to know." "Why did you come here?" His hand stilled for just a moment. "Same reason anyone runs to the wilderness. I was running from something worse." "What was worse?" Garrett looked at her then, really looked at her, and Sarah saw pain in those pale eyes. Old pain, deep and scarring. "War," he said finally. "I fought for the Union, saw things, did things that no man should have to see or do. When it ended, I could not go back to regular life. The noise, the people, the pretending everything was normal. It was suffocating. So I came here." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding more than he probably realized. Sometimes staying away feels safer than risking more pain. Garrett's eyes sharpened. "What are you running from?" "I'm not running. I'm just escaping temporarily." "What is the difference?" Sarah smiled without humor. "I have to go back eventually." They were quiet for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the evening chorus of birds settling into the trees. Finally, Garrett spoke again. "I heard talk in town about you." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What did you hear?" "That men who get close to you tend to disappear, that you are bad luck." She had expected the words to hurt, but hearing them from Garrett stung more than she anticipated. "And you believe that?" "I believe people are superstitious and cruel. I believe bad things happen sometimes, and it is easier to blame someone than to accept that life is random and unfair." Sarah stared at him, surprised by his words. "You do not think I am cursed?" "I think you have had terrible luck. I think people are small-minded, and I think you deserve better than their whispers and sideways looks." Something in Sarah's chest loosened, a knot she had not realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she whispered. Garrett just nodded and returned his attention to the food, but something had shifted between them. Some invisible wall had developed a crack. Over the next several days, they fell into a rhythm. Garrett led them deeper into the mountains, following paths that seemed to exist only in his mind. The landscape was breathtaking. Towering peaks, crystal-clear streams, meadows filled with wildflowers. Sarah had never seen anything so beautiful. She also began to notice things about Garrett, the way he moved with animal grace despite his size, the way he always positioned himself between them and any potential danger, the way his eyes softened, just slightly, when he looked at her father struggling with a steep climb and quietly adjusted their pace without drawing attention to Patrick's difficulty. One evening, while her father slept, Sarah and Garrett sat by the fire together. She had begun to look forward to these quiet conversations, the way he spoke to her like an equal, never dismissing her thoughts or treating her like a fragile thing. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. I might not answer." "Why did you agree to help Deadwood? You could have said no." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Because I remember what it was like to be cold and hungry. Because people need those supplies to survive. Because maybe, somewhere deep down, I still care about something other than my own isolation." "I think you care about more than you let on," Sarah said softly. His eyes cut to her, intense and searching. "You do not know me." "I am beginning to." "What you are beginning to know is dangerous, Sarah." "Why?" "Because I am not a man made for towns and civilization. I'm not someone who can give you the life you deserve." Sarah's heart stuttered. "I did not ask you for anything." "No," Garrett said, his voice rough, "but I see the way you look at me, and I feel things I have no business feeling. so I am warning you now. I am not the man you should pin your hopes on. I am broken in ways that cannot be fixed." Sarah wanted to argue, to tell him that maybe she was broken too, that maybe they could understand each other in ways others could not. But before she could form the words, her father stirred in his sleep, mumbling something unintelligible. The moment passed. Garrett stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, his back to her, conversation clearly over. But his words echoed in Sarah's mind as she lay in her bedroll that night. He felt something for her. He had as much as admitted it, and she felt something for him too, something that had been growing stronger with each passing day, each shared glance, each moment of quiet understanding. The town's warnings about her rang in her ears. Every man who loved her left. But Garrett had said he was nothing like other men. Was he strong enough to break whatever curse seemed to follow her? Or would she lose him too? The next day brought unexpected trouble. They were following a creek through a narrow valley when Garrett suddenly held up his hand, signaling them to stop. He dismounted silently, his entire body tense. "What is it?" Patrick whispered. "Tracks? Fresh? 3 horses? Maybe 4? "Indians?" Sarah's father asked, his hand moving to his rifle. "No, shod horses. White men, probably bandits working these passes." Garrett scanned the surrounding rocks, his expression grim. "They know we are here." Before anyone could respond, a rifle shot cracked through the air. Garrett moved faster than Sarah would have thought possible for such a large man, grabbing her horse's bridle and pulling her toward a cluster of boulders. "Get down! Behind the rocks!" More shots followed. Sarah's father scrambled off his horse and dove for cover. Garrett's gray horse, trained and steady, simply moved to stand between the rocks and the direction of the gunfire. "How many?" Patrick shouted over the noise. "4, like I thought, up in those rocks." Garrett pointed to an outcropping about 100 yards away. "They want our supplies and horses." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded despite the terror coursing through her. Garrett looked at her, then at her father, making some kind of decision. "I'm going to circle around behind them. They will not expect it." "That's suicide," Patrick protested. "It is what I do. Stay here, keep your heads down, and fire a few shots every minute or so. Make them think you are both still pinned down. Do not waste ammunition, just make noise." Before either of them could argue, Garrett moved. He slipped away from the rocks like a shadow, vanishing into the landscape so completely that Sarah lost sight of him within seconds. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She and her father took turns firing shots toward the bandits' position while pressing themselves flat against the boulders. Return fire kicked up dust and stone chips around them. Then, suddenly, the shooting from above stopped. There was shouting, confusion, and then 3 more shots in rapid succession. Silence fell over the valley. "Garrett?" Sarah called, her heart in her throat. No answer. "Garrett!" she shouted louder, starting to stand. Her father grabbed her arm. "Wait! We do not know if it is safe." But Sarah could not wait. Fear for Garrett overwhelmed caution. She stood and began climbing toward the rocky outcropping, her father calling after her. She found Garrett standing among the rocks, rifle still raised, breathing hard. 4 men lay on the ground, 3 clearly dead, 1 wounded and groaning. Garrett's face was spattered with blood, his eyes wild and dangerous. "Are you hurt?" Sarah demanded, running to him. He looked at her as if surprised to see her there. "I told you to stay behind the rocks." "Are you hurt?" she repeated, reaching for him. "No, the blood is not mine." He looked down at the wounded bandit, his expression cold. "This one needs a doctor, but he will not make it. The others were dead before they hit the ground." Sarah should have been horrified. She should have been frightened by the violence, by the hard, lethal man standing before her. Instead, all she felt was overwhelming relief that he was safe. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "But I was not." "You could have been. You took that risk for us." Garrett finally looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. "Of course I did. Did you think I would let them hurt you?" The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah stepped closer, ignoring the blood and the bodies and the wounded man groaning nearby. "Garrett, we need to keep moving," he cut her off, his walls slamming back into place. "More could come. Help me get their weapons and anything useful. Then we ride hard for the next 6 hours." They did not speak of what had happened, But something fundamental had changed. Garrett became even more protective, constantly scanning their surroundings, positioning himself as a barrier between Sarah and any potential threat. And Sarah found herself watching him with new eyes, seeing not just the gruff mountain man, but the warrior underneath, the protector, the man who would kill to keep her safe. 2 days later, they reached the trading post on the outskirts of Cheyenne. The settlement was rough and busy, full of miners, trappers, and traders. Patrick went to negotiate for supplies while Garrett secured lodging for the night, 2 rooms at a boarding house that had seen better days. Sarah found herself alone with Garrett for the first time since the bandit attack. They stood in the narrow hallway outside their rooms, the air thick with tension. "You have been avoiding me," Sarah said. "Yes." "Why?" Garrett leaned against the wall, his large frame somehow looking tired. "Because every moment I spend with you makes it harder to do what I know I must do. Which is, get you safely back to Deadwood and never see you again." Sarah's chest tightened painfully. "Is that what you want?" "What I want does not matter. You deserve a real life, Sarah, a home, a family, a man who can give you stability and comfort. What if I want something different? What if I want someone who understands what it is like to be marked by tragedy? Someone who does not see me as cursed or fragile?" Garrett pushed off the wall and stepped closer, so close Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You do not know what you are asking for. Then tell me. Explain to me why I should not feel what I feel. Because I'm not a good man. Sarah, I have killed more people than I can count. I have nightmares that wake me screaming. I have lived alone in the wilderness for 8 years because I could not stand to be around other human beings. That is not the foundation for the life you deserve." "Stop telling me what I deserve," Sarah said, anger flaring. "Stop making decisions for me. I am a grown woman who has survived her own share of pain and loss. I am not some delicate flower who needs protection from difficult truths." "Then here is a difficult truth," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a near growl. "I am falling in love with you, and it terrifies me, because everyone you love leaves, Sarah, and I do not know if I am strong enough to be the one who stays." Sarah's breath caught, the words she had wanted to hear and feared in equal measure, spoken with brutal honesty in a dingy hallway. "Every man who loved me left," she said quietly, stepping even closer until they were almost touching. "But you told my father you were nothing like other men. Were those empty words, Garrett? Or did you mean them?" His hands came up to cup her face, rough palms gentle against her skin. "I meant them. God help me. I meant them." Then he was kissing her, and Sarah was kissing him back, 8 days of tension and longing and fear pouring into the contact. His beard scratched her skin, his mouth was demanding and desperate, and Sarah felt like she was finally coming alive after years of numbness. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "This is madness." "I know. Your father will probably shoot me." "Probably. I have nothing to offer you. No house, no money, just a cabin in the mountains and a life of solitude." "That sounds perfect." Garrett pulled back to look at her, searching her face. "You cannot mean that." "Why not? What is waiting for me in Deadwood? Whispers and pity and loneliness. At least in the mountains I would have you. I would have peace. I would have a chance at actual happiness instead of slowly dying inside while everyone watches." "Sarah." "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know it is too soon. I know it is reckless, but I do. I love you, Garrett Kane, and I'm tired of being afraid. I'm tired of letting fear and superstition dictate my life." Garrett kissed her again, softer this time, with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I love you too," he murmured against her lips. "I have loved you since you stood in Deadwood and met my eyes without flinching. I have loved you since you rode that cliff trail without complaint. I have loved you since you came running toward danger just to make sure I was safe." They stood wrapped in each other's arms until footsteps on the stairs announced her father's return. They separated reluctantly, but Garrett kept hold of Sarah's hand. Patrick stopped when he saw them, his eyes moving from their joined hands to their faces. "I see," he said carefully. "Sir, I need to speak with you," Garrett said. "I imagine you do." Patrick's expression was unreadable. "My room, now." Sarah squeezed Garrett's hand. "He will not shoot you." "You do not sound certain." I am almost certain, 70% certain at least. Despite everything, Garrett smiled. It transformed his face, making him look years younger. 70%. Those are terrible odds. But you will take them anyway? For you? Yes, I will take them. He followed Patrick into his room, the door closing behind them. Sarah pressed her ear against the wood but could only hear muffled voices. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with several raised voices and what might have been her father swearing. When the door finally opened, both men looked exhausted, but not angry. Garrett's face was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at Sarah, hope, maybe, or relief. "Well?" she demanded, looking between them. "Your young man has made his intentions clear," Patrick said, and Sarah's heart soared at the words, "your young man." "He has asked permission to court you properly. I have agreed, with conditions." "What conditions?" "That you return to Deadwood with us, that he comes to town at least once a month so I can see that you are well, and that you wait 6 months before making any permanent decisions about your future." Sarah wanted to argue, to say 6 months was too long, but she saw the wisdom in it. Her father was protecting her, giving her time to be sure. "I agree," she said. "Furthermore," Patrick continued, "if at the end of those 6 months you still wish to make a life with Garrett, you will have my blessing." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "Db tant way." She threw her arms around her father. "Thank you, Papa. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. This man has promised that if he hurts you, I have permission to shoot him. And I will, Garrett. Make no mistake about that." "Understood, sir," Garrett said solemnly. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow boarding-house bed, unable to stop smiling. Tomorrow they would load up with supplies and begin the journey back to Deadwood. But now everything had changed. She had something to look forward to, something to hope for. The return journey passed in a blur of stolen glances and brief touches whenever her father's attention was elsewhere. Garrett remained vigilant and protective, but there was a new lightness to his demeanor. He smiled more, spoke more, and Sarah caught him watching her with an expression of wonder, as though he could not quite believe she was real. They avoided the pass where they had encountered the bandits, taking a longer but safer route. Patrick seemed to tire more easily on the return trip, and both Sarah and Garrett noticed. They made more frequent stops and set up camp earlier each evening. One night, while Patrick slept, Sarah and Garrett sat together by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Tell me about your cabin," she said. "It is small, 1 room with a loft for sleeping. I built it myself from pine logs. There's a creek nearby where I get water and good hunting in the surrounding forest." "It sounds wonderful." "It is isolated. The nearest neighbor is 2 days' ride. Winters are hard. You would be cut off from everything and everyone for months at a time." "I grew up in Deadwood, Garrett. I know about hard winters." "This would be different, harder, lonelier." Sarah lifted her head to look at him. "I would have you. That's the opposite of lonely." He kissed her forehead, her temple, her cheek. 6 months seems like an eternity." "Then visit often," Papa said, "once a month. Make it twice." "I will come as often as you want me." "Then I will see you every week," Sarah said, only half joking. Garrett chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Every week. Yes, I can do that." They arrived back in Deadwood on a clear morning, the sun turning the muddy streets to gold. People stopped and stared as they rode through town, Patrick on his horse, Sarah on hers, and Garrett Kane on his massive gray, all 3 of them dusty and tired, but safe. Mrs. Henderson stood outside the dry goods store, her mouth hanging open. "They made it back," she said to no one in particular. Word spread quickly. The mountain man had guided them safely through dangerous territory and back again. The supplies were being unloaded at the general store. And most shocking of all, Sarah McKenna was alive and well, clearly unafflicted by whatever curse supposedly followed her. Over the following days, Garrett helped organize a proper supply run with armed guards and multiple wagons. He drew maps, suggested routes, and offered advice that the town council took seriously. But mostly, he stayed close to Sarah. They walked together through town, enduring stares and whispers. They sat on the porch of the general store in the evenings, talking for hours. Garrett helped Patrick with repairs to the building, his strength and carpentry skills making quick work of projects that had languished for months. And slowly, Deadwood began to see Sarah differently, not as a cursed woman, but as someone who had survived tragedy and come out stronger. The presence of the formidable mountain man at her side did not hurt either. Garrett Kane was not the kind of man anyone would describe as weak or easily frightened. 3 weeks after their return, Garrett reluctantly prepared to head back to his mountain cabin. He needed to check his traps, repair winter damage to his home, and restock his own supplies. Sarah walked with him to where his horse waited at the edge of town. 2 weeks, she said. You will come back in 2 weeks? 2 weeks, he promised, taking both her hands in his. Maybe less if I can manage it. I will count every day. So will I. He pulled her close, unconcerned with who might see. I am not Thomas, Sarah. I'm not James or William. I will come back. I will always come back. Tears stung her eyes. I believe you. Good. Because I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. He kissed her then, deep and slow, a promise and a claim. When he finally pulled away and mounted his horse, Sarah stood watching until he disappeared into the northern hills. True to his word, Garrett returned 13 days later, then 12 days after that, then 10. Each visit was the same. He would arrive in town, help Patrick with whatever needed doing, spend every possible moment with Sarah, and then reluctantly return to the mountains, always with a promise of when he would return. The town grew accustomed to seeing the mountain man riding in regularly. Some of the initial fear faded, replaced by grudging respect. Garrett was quiet and kept to himself, but he was unfailingly polite and helpful when asked. Children who had once run from him began to wave in greeting. Summer turned to autumn, the mountains painting themselves in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah marked off days on a calendar in her room, counting down to the 6 months her father had requested. During one visit in late September, Garrett pulled Patrick aside. Sir, the 6 months are nearly up. I'm aware. I love your daughter. I want to marry her, build a life with her. But I need to know you truly support this, not just tolerate it. Patrick studied the younger man for a long moment. When my wife died, I thought I would never trust anyone else with Sarah's happiness. She is everything to me, Garrett. Everything. I know, sir. But I see how she lights up when you arrive. I see how you look at her like she hung the moon. I see that you are gentle with her despite your size and strength. I see that you come back, again and again, no matter what. Patrick's voice grew thick with emotion. You have proven yourself. You have my blessing, and more than that, you have my gratitude. You gave my daughter back her hope. The two men shook hands. Then Patrick pulled Garrett into a brief, gruff embrace. When Garrett proposed that evening, he did it simply. He and Sarah were walking along the creek that ran behind the town, the autumn air crisp and cool. He stopped at a spot where the water ran clear over smooth stones and turned to face her. 6 months have passed, he said. They have, Sarah agreed, her heart beginning to race. Your father has given his blessing. Has he? Sarah McKenna, I know I am not the man you probably imagined marrying. I cannot offer you a fine house or an easy life, but I can offer you my whole heart, my complete devotion, and a lifetime of coming back to you no matter what. Will you marry me? Yes, Sarah said, not needing even a moment to think about it. Yes, absolutely yes. Garrett swept her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools. I do not have a ring, he admitted. I'm not good at these things. I do not need a ring. I just need you. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Deadwood. Sarah wore a dress of deep blue that her father had ordered special from Cheyenne. Garrett wore new clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, and a vest, though he drew the line at cutting his hair or trimming his beard much. The church was packed. The entire town turned out, curious to witness the wedding of the supposedly cursed woman and the mountain man. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed Sarah with a tenderness that made several women in the congregation sigh. Patrick stood to the side, his eyes wet, smiling through his tears. The reception was held at the general store, with tables set up in the street. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing and laughter and more food than Sarah had seen in one place since before the supply shortage. As the sun began to set, Garrett pulled Sarah aside. Ready to go home? Home, Sarah repeated, testing the word. Yes, I am ready. They had discussed their future at length over the past months. Sarah would move to Garrett's mountain cabin, but they would maintain close ties to Deadwood. They would come to town every month to check on Patrick and help as needed. And if the isolation became too much for Sarah, they would build a small house closer to civilization. But Sarah knew in her heart that she would love the mountains. She would love the peace, the beauty, the chance to build something new with the man she loved. They left Deadwood the next morning, Sarah riding beside her husband toward her new life. Patrick stood in front of the general store, waving until they disappeared from view. It was bittersweet, this parting, but not painful. Patrick knew his daughter was happy. He knew Garrett would care for her, and he knew they would return. The journey to Garrett's cabin took 3 days. With each mile, Sarah felt the weight of the past years falling away. The whispers, the pitying looks, the constant reminder of her failures, all of it remained behind in Deadwood, unable to follow her into this new chapter. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Sarah understood why Garrett loved it. The structure sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a creek bubbling nearby and mountains rising majestically in every direction. It was beautiful and isolated and perfect. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kane," Garrett said, dismounting and reaching up to lift her from her saddle. "Mrs. Kane," Sarah repeated, loving the sound of it. "I'm going to have to get used to that." Garrett carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the absurdity and rightness of the tradition. Inside, the cabin was simple but well made, with a large fireplace, sturdy furniture that Garrett had built himself, and windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. "It is wonderful," Sarah said, looking around. "We can make changes. Add on if you want. I know it is small." "It is perfect." She turned to face him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You are perfect." "I am far from perfect, Sarah. You are perfect for me. That is all that matters." That night, they made love for the first time in the loft bed beneath the rafters, with moonlight streaming through the windows and the sound of the creek singing them to sleep afterward. Sarah lay in Garrett's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and knew she had found where she belonged. The following months were an adjustment, but not a difficult one. Sarah learned to hunt and fish, to preserve food for winter, to read the weather and the forest. Garrett taught her everything he knew, patient and encouraging even when she made mistakes. She also discovered talents she had not known she possessed. She was good at tanning hides, turning Garrett's hunting into soft leather they could trade in town. She had a gift for finding useful plants, learning which were medicinal and which were edible. And she could shoot with increasing accuracy, practicing until Garrett declared her capable of protecting herself if needed. Winter arrived early that year, sealing them into their mountain home with snow that piled higher than the windows. But Sarah did not feel trapped. She felt cocooned, safe, deliriously happy. They spent the long winter nights by the fire, talking and reading and making love. Garrett told her stories of his time in the war, painful memories he had never shared with another living soul. Sarah told him about growing up without a mother, about the loneliness that had defined so much of her life before him. They healed together, two broken people finding wholeness in each other. Spring arrived with a rush of melting snow and returning life. The creek swelled and roared, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and animals emerged from hibernation. Garrett and Sarah made their first trip to Deadwood since the winter snows had begun. Patrick hugged his daughter so tightly she could barely breathe. "I worried," he admitted. "I know you are capable. I know Garrett is with you, but I still worried." "I am happy, Papa," Sarah assured him. "Happier than I have ever been." It was true. The curse that had supposedly followed her seemed laughable now. Thomas, James, and William were part of another life, a different Sarah. She grieved for them still, but no longer felt defined by their leaving. She had found a man who stayed, who kept his promises, who loved her with a fierce protective devotion that never wavered. Over the following years, Sarah and Garrett built a life that was uniquely theirs. They expanded the cabin, adding a second room and a covered porch. They acquired chickens and a milk cow. Garrett built Sarah a large garden, and she coaxed vegetables and herbs from the mountain soil. They made friends with a Shoshone family that lived in the next valley over, trading goods and sharing meals. They traveled to Cheyenne twice a year for supplies, and they returned to Deadwood regularly, maintaining their connection to Patrick in the town. On Sarah's 26th birthday, she told Garrett she was pregnant. He stood frozen for a full minute, then let out a whoop of joy that startled the chickens and probably echoed across 3 valleys. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "I am going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "A wonderful father," Sarah corrected. Their son was born the following spring, arriving during a rainstorm that battered the cabin and turned the creek into a raging torrent. Patrick had come to stay for the birth, and he paced the main room while Sarah labored in the bedroom, Garrett at her side the entire time. When the baby's first cry split the air, Garrett wept openly. He held his son with hands that could snap a man's neck, but cradled the infant with infinite gentleness. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered, staring at the tiny face. "Sarah, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, exhausted but glowing. Garrett thought for a long moment. "Thomas, after your first love. He deserves to be remembered." Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. After everything, after all the pain and loss, Garrett was honoring the men who had come before him. It was typical of his generosity, his understanding that Sarah's past was part of what made her who she was. "Thomas Kane," she said. "It is perfect." Patrick came in to meet his grandson, his eyes suspiciously wet. "He looks like you, Sarah. Same red hair." "He has Garrett's eyes, though," Sarah said. "Look at that pale blue." Little Thomas grew strong and healthy, thriving in the mountain air. He was walking by 10 months, climbing everything by a year, and chattering constantly by 2. Garrett was an attentive, devoted father, teaching his son about the forest and animals, carrying the boy on his shoulders during long walks, telling him stories by the firelight. When Thomas was 3, Sarah became pregnant again. Their daughter arrived in autumn, small and fierce, with Sarah's green eyes and Garrett's dark hair. They named her Grace, for the grace that had brought them together and sustained them through everything. The cabin rang with children's laughter, with the sounds of a family. Garrett, who had once lived in complete solitude, found himself constantly surrounded by noise and activity and love. He thrived on it, becoming even more grounded and content. Years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas learned to ride, to hunt, to track game through the forest. Grace proved to have her mother's gift with plants and healing. Both children were as comfortable in the wilderness as their father, as strong and capable as their mother. Patrick remained a constant presence in their lives, making the journey to the cabin whenever weather permitted, the children making the journey to Deadwood to visit their grandfather. He was in his 70s now, slower and grayer, but still sharp-minded and loving. On a summer evening when Thomas was 8 and Grace was 5, the family sat on their porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. Garrett had his arm around Sarah, Grace asleep in his lap, Thomas sitting at their feet whittling a piece of wood. "Do you ever miss it?" Garrett asked quietly. "Town life? Convenience? Other people?" Sarah turned to look at her husband, taking in his weathered face, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, the pale blue eyes that still looked at her with the same love and wonder they had held that first day in Deadwood. "Never," she said truthfully. "This is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it. You gave me a life, Garrett, a real life, not just existence." "You gave me one too," he replied, kissing her temple. "I was just surviving before you. Now I'm living." Thomas looked up from his whittling. "Papa, tell us the story again, about how you and Mama met." It was his favorite story, one Garrett had told 100 times but never tired of telling. "Well," Garrett began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller, "there was a woman in a town called Deadwood, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, with fire-red hair and eyes like mountain lakes. But the town folks whispered that she was cursed, that every man who loved her left." "That is silly," Grace mumbled sleepily. "Mama is not cursed." "I know that now, little one, but they warned me anyway. They said I should stay away, that I would leave just like all the others." "But what did you say?" Thomas asked, even though he knew the answer. "I said, I am nothing like those other men. And I meant it, because I knew from the moment I saw your mama that she was the one person in the world worth staying for." Sarah blinked back tears, the way she did every time Garrett told this story. After all these years, he could still make her cry with the simple honesty of his love. And you did stay," Thomas said with satisfaction. "You stayed forever." "Forever and a day," Garrett agreed, pulling Sarah closer. "Forever and a day." As darkness fell over the mountains and stars began to pepper the sky, the Kane family remained on their porch, wrapped in contentment and love. The curse that had once defined Sarah's life was nothing more than a distant memory, broken by a mountain man who had kept his promise. He had stayed. Through every season, every challenge, every joy and sorrow, Garrett Kane had stayed. And in staying, he had given Sarah something she had once thought impossible: a home, a family, and a love that would last all their days. Years continued to unfold in their mountain sanctuary. Thomas grew tall and broad-shouldered like his father, while Grace developed her mother's quick wit and her father's steady determination. Both children helped with the daily work of maintaining their homestead, learning the value of hard work and self-sufficiency. When Thomas turned 15, he expressed interest in learning the blacksmith trade. A family in Deadwood had offered to take him on as an apprentice. Garrett and Sarah discussed it at length, both of them understanding that their children needed to forge their own paths, even if it meant letting them go. "He will come back," Sarah said one night after Thomas had gone to bed, "just like you always came back to me." "How can you be certain?" Garrett asked. "Because we taught him that home is not just a place, it is the people who love you. He will explore, find his way, but these mountains are in his blood." She was right. Thomas spent 2 years in Deadwood learning his trade, then returned to the mountains and built a forge near the cabin. He made tools and horseshoes, knives and hinges, selling his work in town, but always returning home to the life he loved. Grace, meanwhile, became known as a healer. She had learned from her mother and from books Patrick sent from back east, developing a reputation that spread through the territory. People began making the difficult journey to the Kane homestead, seeking her help, and Grace never turned anyone away. Patrick passed peacefully in his sleep when Sarah was 38 years old. The entire family traveled to Deadwood for the funeral, and Sarah wept for the father who had given her his blessing to follow her heart. They buried him on a hill overlooking the town he had loved, and Sarah placed wildflowers from the mountains on his grave. "He was proud of you," Garrett told her afterward. "He told me so many times. He said you became exactly who you were meant to be." "I became who I was meant to be because of both of you," Sarah replied. "You and Papa, you both believed in me when no one else did." They stayed in Deadwood for a month after the funeral, settling Patrick's affairs and closing the general store. Sarah donated most of her father's possessions to the community, keeping only a few precious items: his favorite pipe, a photograph of him and her mother, and the ledger where he had marked off the days during that first 6 months of her courtship with Garrett. Returning to the mountain cabin felt like coming home after a long journey. Sarah had loved her father deeply, and she grieved his loss, but she also felt a sense of peace. He had lived a good life, had seen her happy and settled, had known his grandchildren. There were no regrets, no unfinished business. As Sarah entered her 40s, she found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this place. She thought about the young woman who had stood in the general store, listening to whispers about curses and doomed love. She barely recognized that scared, lonely girl. Life had taught her that curses were just stories people told when they could not explain tragedy. That love was not about perfect circumstances or guaranteed outcomes. That sometimes the strongest bonds were forged between two broken people who refused to give up on each other. Thomas married a young woman from Deadwood when he was 22, bringing her to live near the family homestead. She was a kind, practical woman who loved the mountains almost as much as Thomas did. Within a year, they gave Garrett and Sarah their first grandchild, a boy with Thomas's blue eyes and his mother's dark curls. Grace married later, at 25, to a traveling doctor who had sought her help with a difficult case and stayed far longer than he intended. They built a small clinic near the homestead, serving the scattered communities throughout the territory. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Sarah on a journey back to the creek where he had proposed. They were both graying now, with lines around their eyes and hands calloused from years of work. But when Garrett looked at Sarah, he still saw the fierce, beautiful woman who had ridden into the mountains without fear. 25 years, he said, pulling her close. Do you have any regrets? Not a single one, Sarah replied honestly. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I needed. The town thought you were cursed. The town was wrong. I was never cursed. I was just waiting. For what? For a mountain man who was nothing like other men. For someone strong enough to stay when staying was hard. For you, Garrett. I was waiting for you. He kissed her then, slow and sweet. 25 years of love and devotion poured into the contact. When they broke apart, both were smiling. I told you I would always come back, Garrett said. You did more than come back, Sarah replied. You stayed. You built a life with me. You gave me children and grandchildren and more happiness than I ever dreamed possible. They stood by the creek until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to their love. The years continued their steady march. Garrett's hair turned fully silver, though he remained strong and capable well into his 60s. Sarah's auburn hair faded to a soft copper gray, and her face bore the lines of a life well lived and much loved. They had 7 grandchildren eventually, with the promise of more to come. The family homestead had expanded into a small compound, with Thomas's forge, Grace's clinic, and several cabins for the extended family. The Kane name became known throughout the territory, not for wealth or power, but for integrity, skill, and generosity. On Garrett's 70th birthday, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Children ran through the clearing, their laughter echoing off the mountains. The smell of roasting meat filled the air. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing as the sun set. Garrett stood at the edge of the clearing with Sarah at his side, watching their family with an expression of profound contentment. Hard to believe, is it not? Sarah said. That lonely mountain man and the supposedly cursed woman. Look what they built. We built it together, Garrett corrected. Every moment, every decision, every challenge. We faced it together. And we will continue to face everything together, Sarah said, leaning against him. For as long as we both shall live, Garrett tightened his arm around her. Forever and a day, remember? Forever and a day, Sarah agreed. Thomas approached with his eldest son, a gangly teenager who looked exactly like Garrett had at that age. Papa, grandfather, young Garrett wants to know if you will tell the story, about how you and grandmother met. Garrett looked at Sarah, who nodded with a smile. It had become a family tradition, this story, passed down and retold until it had taken on an almost mythical quality. The family gathered around as Garrett began to speak, his voice strong and sure despite his years. There was a woman in a town called Deadwood, the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Sarah listened to her husband tell their story one more time, hearing the love in every word. She looked around at their children, their grandchildren, the life they had created from nothing but determination and devotion. The townspeople had been wrong. She had never been cursed. She had simply been waiting for the right person, someone strong enough, stubborn enough, loving enough to break through all the fear and pain and prove that real love existed. Garrett finished the story to applause and requests for more tales. He obliged, sharing stories of their early years in the mountains, of the challenges they had overcome, of the adventures they had shared. As the celebration continued into the night, Sarah found a quiet moment alone with Garrett under the stars. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being nothing like those other men, for proving everyone wrong, for giving me this extraordinary life." Garrett cupped her face in his hands, the gesture as tender now as it had been 27 years ago in that dingy boarding house hallway in Cheyenne. "You gave me a life worth living, Sarah. Before you, I was just existing, hiding from the world and my own pain. You made me whole." "We made each other whole," Sarah corrected. "Yes," Garrett agreed. "We did." They remained there under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from their broken pieces. The curse that had once defined Sarah's existence was nothing more than a cautionary tale now, a story of what could have been if she had not met a certain mountain man who refused to be scared away. Garrett and Sarah lived for many more years in their mountain home, surrounded by family and love. They grew old together, their bodies slowing, but their devotion never wavering. On quiet evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset behind the mountains, hands intertwined, grateful for every moment they had been given. When Garrett finally passed at the age of 83, he died peacefully in his sleep with Sarah at his side. She held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude. Sarah lived 5 more years without him, though she said often that part of her had died with Garrett. She was surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her, but everyone could see that she was merely waiting, counting the days until she would be reunited with her mountain man. On a spring morning when the wildflowers were blooming and the creek was singing with snowmelt, Sarah Kane closed her eyes and did not wake up. Her family found her in her bed, a peaceful smile on her face, looking younger than she had in years. They buried her next to Garrett on a hill overlooking the homestead, with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The gravestone was simple but perfect. Sarah and Garrett Kane. He stayed. She loved. Together, they built a life that broke every curse and proved that real love exists. The family homestead continued for generations, the story of Sarah and Garrett passed down to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The tale of the supposedly cursed woman and the mountain man who refused to leave became a legend in the territory, told around campfires and dinner tables, a reminder that love could conquer even the darkest superstitions. And on quiet evenings when the wind moved through the pines, some said they could hear laughter echoing across the mountains, the sound of 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and loved each other forever and a day. Thomas Kane, now an old man himself, stood on the porch of the original cabin and looked out at the compound his parents had started. His own children had children now, and those children were beginning to have children of their own. The Kane legacy had spread throughout the territory, a testament to 2 people who had refused to accept the limitations others tried to place on them. "Tell us again," his youngest granddaughter said, tugging at his sleeve, "about grandmother and grandfather." Thomas smiled, settling into the rocking chair his father had built 60 years ago. "Well now," he began, "there was a woman in a town called Deadwood." And so the story continued, passed from generation to generation, a reminder that curses could be broken, that love could conquer fear, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began with a simple declaration: "I am nothing like those other men." Sarah had been right all those years ago. She had not been cursed. She had simply been waiting for someone strong enough to stay. And Garrett had given her that, and so much more, a life filled with love, family, adventure, and the kind of happiness that only comes from finding your perfect match. The mountains stood eternal, watching over the Kane family for generation after generation, bearing silent witness to a love story that had defied every expectation and created a legacy that would last forever. In Deadwood, now a thriving town with paved streets and electric lights, an old woman sat on her porch and told her great-grandchildren about the old days. Mrs. Henderson was over 90 now, but her memory was sharp. "I remember Sarah McKenna," she said. "Everyone said she was cursed, that every man who loved her left. I was one of the ones who said it, I'm ashamed to admit." "What happened to her?" one child asked. "She met a mountain man named Garrett Kane, a big, strong, quiet man who was not afraid of curses or gossip. He loved her, married her, and took her to live in the mountains. They had children and grandchildren, and a life that was the envy of everyone who had ever pitied her." "Did he leave like the others?" another child asked. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "No, child. He stayed until the day he died, and she stayed with him. They proved all of us wrong. Sometimes I think about that, about how cruel we were with our whispers and our warnings. Sarah McKenna was never cursed. She was blessed. She just had to wait for the right person to see it." The children ran off to play, but Mrs. Henderson remained on her porch, remembering a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes who had endured gossip and grief with quiet dignity. She remembered a mountain man who had come to town and changed everything. "I hope you forgive us, Sarah," she whispered to the wind. "I hope you had the beautiful life you deserved." In the mountains north of Deadwood, the wind whispered through the pines surrounding the Kane homestead. Wildflowers bloomed on 2 graves on a hillside, tended lovingly by descendants who had never met the couple but knew their story by heart. The curse had been broken by a love too strong to be defeated by superstition or fear. Sarah and Garrett had proved that sometimes the greatest love stories were not the easiest or the most conventional. Sometimes they required patience, courage, and the willingness to trust in something bigger than fear. Their story became more than just a family legend. It became a testament to the power of staying, of commitment, of choosing love even when love seemed impossible. It inspired countless others in the territory and beyond, showing that curses were nothing more than stories we told ourselves, and that real love could conquer anything. And so, in the end, the woman whom everyone said was cursed became the woman who had been blessed beyond measure. The mountain man who had lived in isolation found a family that filled his heart to overflowing, and together they built a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Forever and a day, just as Garrett had promised. Forever and a day.